In this video, I'm going to be covering the taxonomy of animals in the game Rain World. As a general disclaimer, real-world taxonomy is not directly applicable to the world of Rain World. Taxonomy shows the relationships between living things. This is designed to be an educational thought experiment intended to familiarize people with general taxonomic groups and their characteristics, so it's not a useful tool for the actual hypotheses regarding phylogeny that would be applicable to this game. I'll only be covering animals because my botany skills are honestly subpar, so assume domain Eukarya and kingdom Animalia unless otherwise explicitly stated. Alright, starting off with the Batfly. The Batfly is a very common creature in the game, though it's difficult to determine whether or not it has an exoskeleton, so I created two potential classifications based on whether or not it had this. If it has an exoskeleton, it falls under phylum Arthropoda, as all of the characteristics that we'd be able to see would line up with characteristics of arthropods. From the images that I have access to, particularly the opening cutscene images, if you look closely you can only see roughly 2 legs there. Functionally, it is difficult to classify it any further, solely due to the fact that further classification requires more specific and noticeable limb differentiation. Arthropod is as far as it's capable of being classified on that end. If it has no exoskeleton, it would be under phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and order Chiroptera, which is the order of bats. As you can see, those membranous wings that it has do somewhat more resemble the fleshy membranes of bats and seem to have a bit more structural integrity, though they are a bit more curved and malleable, similar to insect wings, so that makes it difficult. Alright, next up, the blue fruit. In dialogue, this is revealed to actually be a bug pupa, and we know that because it's a pupa, it belongs to phylum Arthropoda, though if we take the dialogue literally to mean a bug, that specifically means subphylum Hexapoda, class Insecta, and order Hemiptera, which is the order of true bugs, such as cicadas, though colloquially bug can refer to basically any insectoid arthropod, so functionally this dialogue could imply in a literal sense being a true bug, or it could simply imply that it is some kind of arthropod in the game. Alright, the background bugs. Most are in phylum Arthropoda. We can't see that many details, so it would be difficult to classify them any further. The water glowworms, however, seem to fall under phylum Annelida and class Polychaeta, or the polychaetes, because of their mode of mobility, living conditions, and their specific way of moving around, resembling polychaetes. Alright, centipedes. Centipedes are definitely in phylum Arthropoda, and potentially subphylum Myriapoda and class Chilopoda like real-world centipedes. The complications with this is that there are too many antennae for an arthropod. There are 4 antennae total, if you look closely, and 4 antennae is a characteristic of crustaceans, but they don't have proper body segments to be considered crustaceans. Now, one hypothesis that could explain this is that the second set of antennae is actually an electrical attachment organ. If you have played the game, you do probably know that they need to attach both sides of their head to something in order to execute an electrical attack. Another complication is a lack of clear cephalization, because in Safari mode you can control them from either side, and they're capable of intaking inputs from either side. This could imply that they don't have a clear head end, or that they have a head but it is functionally capable of controlling either side. And similar to centipedes, of course, they have one pair of limbs per body segment, and they follow a specific form of tagmatization that is very distinct and results in a lot of serially repeating segments. Alright, next up are the Cwing and Aquapede variants. These are variants of the centipede. They have similar taxonomy, but with more specialized locomotive structures, wings in the case of Cwings, and swimming appendages in the case of the Aquapede. Cwing larvae do not actually have the ability to fly and have the standard locomotive structures of the in-game centipedes. Aquapede motion resembles polychaetes, which I just made a note of because I think it's interesting, but because of the lack of notable cephalization and their relation to the in-game centipedes, I don't think this actually has any bearing on potential phylogeny within the game. A funny name I came up with and because of their specialized locomotive structures, is Myriaptera, which is a combination of the terms myriapod, which is in reference to creatures like centipedes and millipedes, which have a myriad of legs and appendages that way, and ptera, which is for wings or, in certain cases, fins. Alright, next up, egg bugs. Egg bugs fall under phylum Arthropoda, but they only have 4 limbs, so they're tetrapods, and no real-world arthropods are tetrapods, so they cannot be classified any further. Alright, next up is the Noodle Fly. Honestly, I can't even narrow down on a phylum for these things. They are super weird. They don't have an exoskeleton. They have amniotic eggs for some reason, but they have 4 membranous wings that resemble insect wings, and 6 legs, which is a very insectoid characteristic. Functionally, they have so many characteristics from so many groups that it's really impossible to narrow them down to any particular group. Alright, next up are snails, which would be phylum Mollusca and class Gastropoda. Of course, they have the shells and locomotive structures on the bottom, which are characteristics of phylum Gastropoda. They do have weird mobility structures which resemble legs, though. And this could potentially be operculum structures, similar to the operculum mobility of the conch, where it actually makes a conch look like they're hopping instead of gliding around like most snails do. So it is similar that the locomotive structures are something akin to that. Alright, next up is the Squidcata. This one was difficult, but I went with phylum Mollusca, class Cephalopoda, and order Teuthida because they resemble squids and because those tentacles are an attachment organ, as well as the glean on the model in-game implying slicker skin, which could imply being a cephalopod rather than an insect or something with an exoskeleton. Alright, next up are Dropwigs. Dropwigs are also arthropods, and they are also tetrapods like the egg bugs mentioned before. One YouTuber who does a lot of content regarding Rainworld, Das Zombis, I think that's how it's pronounced, apologies if I pronounced that wrong, had a hypothesis that the egg bug and the dropwig are effectively an example of extreme sexual dimorphism, which, both being tetrapods, is a supporting feature of. Alright, next up are the lizards, which would fall under phylum Chordata, class Reptilia, and order Squamata, similar to real-world lizards. There are several varieties with characteristics of various types of real-world lizards. For instance, the blue lizards, which can climb on stuff in the background, similarly in nature to a gecko climbing on stuff, or the white lizards, which are capable of camouflaging, meaning they have chromatophores similar to chameleons of the real world. Now, the caramel lizard has 6 legs, which is a very odd characteristic, and the cyan lizard apparently has jet thrusters, which is actually a trait that we'll see come up later. My hypothesis on this has to do with the Rain World lore, that being there are several creatures that either are or descend from creatures called purposed organisms, which are synthetically engineered. My hypothesis is that these jet thrusters originated as a structure from the purposed organisms, but the genetic characteristics for this got into the ecosystem and allowed different animals to evolve in ways accommodating mobility using these, which permits body forms that would be less than viable in the real world. Alright, next up are the salamander, eel lizard, and strawberry lizard variants. They're all chordates. The salamander, I believe, is class Amphibia, order Urodela, which is the class of real-world salamanders. They have a lot of similar characteristics, like the capacity to grow external gills, and they seem to have more malleable skin than the lizards that are in a more standard form. The eel lizard, 2 hypotheses here. One is class Amphibia and another is class Reptilia. And this entirely depends on whether the eel lizard, which is only found in the rivulet campaign in the game, descended from the salamanders as a more aquatic variation of them, or from the other lizards in the game adapting to the more aquatic environment present in the rivulet campaign. And last up is the strawberry lizard, which is kind of a gray area between reptiles and mammals. So it's a bit difficult to determine between those classes because it does have fur, but all of its other characteristics are shared with the other lizards within the game, other than its quicker mobility because of its smaller body size. Alright, next up are vultures, which I believe to be in phylum Chordata and class Aves. I added a parentheses in Reptilia there because there is still some debate in taxonomy whether birds are actually just a sub-variation of reptiles. But it has easily disabled limbs, implying very brittle bone structure, high metabolism, it's always hunting, complex social structures, with the masks seeming to be a prominent feature of these animals. And the square cube law versus jet engine comes into this because most birds are limited in their capacity for size due to the square cube law, but because of the introduction of jet engines into the genetic capacities of the environment, these things were able to kind of circumvent that and have a large body form that is capable of flight. And the structures on its wings actually do somewhat resemble feathers, so that could imply more avian characteristics. Next up are vulture grubs. All I could really think of here is phylum Arthropoda. I don't believe that they're directly related to the vultures, but instead, because of their biomechanical characteristics, simply developed to summon the vultures as a defense mechanism to keep them from being attacked as other predators. In fact, if there are no other creatures in the area, the vultures will just pick up the vulture grubs and leave, which could imply that the vultures just pick them up for an extra snack if they don't do something useful, which could be 2 species kind of narrowing down the best genetic traits, with the vultures killing off the vulture grubs that aren't useful in finding food, and the vulture grubs helping the vultures to find optimal food as some form of mutualism. Alright, next up are leeches, which I actually think seem to be more similar to real-world lampreys. They definitely seem to be agnathans, and they only have one sucker on one end. So that would put them in phylum Chordata and class Petromyzontida. Real-world leeches actually have a sucker on both ends and use that in some form of mobility, so these things do more closely resemble characteristics of lampreys. Alright, next up are spiders. Spiders, phylum Arthropoda, subphylum Chelicerata, class Arthropoda, order Araneae. Just like real-world spiders, you can see there from the model of the tiny coelescipede, which is the one on the upper right-hand side. It does have the 4 sets of 2 limbs with pedipalps up front and probably some other limb characteristics there. The spiders are probably somewhat closely related, as we do see with the mother spider as depicted on the lower left-hand side. In-game releases a ton of coelescipedes, implying that the coelescipedes spawn from the mother spider. The one that's probably a different genetic tree is most likely the spitter spider, which is depicted on the bottom right-hand side because of its unique characteristics. Next up are Garbageworms in phylum Chordata, subphylum Craniata, and infraphylum Vertebrata. Now I'm using the subphylum Craniata infraphylum Vertebrata system because it provides for better placement of hagfish, and it's what I learned in my General Biology 2 class. They resemble garden eels, and they seem to have a jaw or other grabbing organ, which is a characteristic more akin to vertebrates than invertebrate chordates, as invertebrate chordates are functionally all jawless. Alright, next up are Scavengers. Now, Scavengers would fall under phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and order Primates. The teeth aren't shown, which limits classification accuracy, because we can't get a good read on their specialization of food. They do have complex social structures, similar to real-world primates, and they do follow with a lot of the general characteristics of primates in the real world. Alright, next up are Jetfish, which I believe are in phylum Chordata and class Sarcopterygii, or the lobe-finned fishes. They have 4 limbs which do kind of have a lobe format, and they're capable of surviving out of the water for some time, which could imply a similar function to lungfish, for instance, which are in class Sarcopterygii. Next up is the jellyfish. Now, jellyfish would be in phylum Cnidaria, and could either be a superorganism or class Scyphozoa. Scyphozoa is kind of hinted at in dialogue by them being referred to as jellyfish, which could imply that they are true jellyfish, which fall under class Scyphozoa. But the smaller jellyfish there on the left do resemble the Portuguese man-o'-war and hang out near the top of the water, similar to that creature as well. So the giant jellyfish depicted on the right could conceivably be Scyphozoan, but the smaller jellyfish might also just be a superorganism similar to the Portuguese man-o'-war. Alright, next up are Hazers, which fall under phylum Mollusca, class Cephalopoda, and order Teuthida. They are very squid-like in nature, and have a lot of characteristics innate to squids, like those big eyes and the head shape. Next up are Leviathans, phylum Chordata and class Actinopterygii. It's a bit hard to get a read on these things because of their giant mechanical jaws not giving us any hints through their head shape, but they do have several fins and other propulsion organs kind of along the side, and that's generally more of a characteristic of Actinopterygii than Sarcopterygii. They also don't really seem to have a cartilaginous skeleton, based kind of on their mobility and their general similarities to an eel. Next up are Miros birds, phylum Chordata and class Aves. They seem to have a lot of characteristics in common with birds. They have that beak, high metabolism, a lot of that stuff, and some even have feathers kind of making up a frill or spine on the back. So if you're having trouble making it out, these things are most prominently found in very dark areas, so their most notable and easy to see characteristic is that one big eye that you see, and they have very good eyesight, also similar to birds. Alright, next up, Miros vultures. Miros vultures would be Chordata and Aves. They are seemingly highly modified organisms. They have blades for wings. They have a laser that shoots out of their eye and creates explosions. So I really think that these things are just genetically modified variations of the Miros bird and vulture. Either that or come from the same general genetic makeup as the Miros bird and vulture, and are modified to select for different characteristics. Alright, next up, lantern mice, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and order Rodentia. Now, the only really curious part about these is the weird spinneret-like organ they have on their back that allow them to hang down off of stuff. It doesn't make a ton of sense for a mammal to develop, but it is conceivable for a mammal to develop a feature such as that. Alright, next up, grappling worms, phylum Annelida and subphylum Clitolata. They seem very similar to real-world leeches, which fall under class Hyrodinia. They have functional mouth organs on both sides of the body, but they use it in a different way, and it's a bit hard to kind of estimate the feeding mechanism of the grappling worm in Rain World because it really doesn't display any characteristics that give us a good idea of what's going on there. Next up is the reindeer, which would be phylum Chordata and class Mammalia. Real deers belong to an order that contains odd-toed ungulates. In the game, their weird leg structure kind of seems to make it look like the reindeer don't actually have toes at all, so I couldn't really classify it any further than class. The stowaway, which I believe to be in phylum Cnidaria, and this goes into my advanced terrestrial Cnidarian hypothesis, which I will explain later. Alright, next up are yeeks. Yeeks I believe to be members of phylum Chordata and class Reptilia. They're not found near water usually. They have rigid dorsal spines, and they have more complex social vocalizations than most amphibians have. They don't have any characteristics of mammals or birds, so that effectively means that they're either going to be a reptile or amphibian, and mostly because of their vocalizations seeming to serve a more complex social role than would be present in amphibians, and the lack of a clearly visible tympanic membrane, I do believe that they would more closely fall under class Reptilia. Alright, mobile rot cysts, neuron flies, and inspectors. All of these are purely synthetic organisms. created to serve some function, or in an unfortunate development in the case of mobile rot cysts. Okay, pole plants and monster kelp, which seem like plants, but this plays into my advanced terrestrial cnidarian hypothesis. That being that because Rain World has an environment where the rain is constantly flooding the area, it opened the door for cnidarian polyps to develop into more complex organisms and develop a terrestrial lifestyle in order to have some form of development during the time periods where there wasn't rain covering an entire area. Alright, and finally the Slug Cats. Slug Cats would be phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, and order Rodentia. They have no cutaneous respiration, which would be a characteristic of amphibians, no bird-like characteristics, and they don't seem to be reptilian either. They're omnivorous. They provide parental care for young, which is a common characteristic of rodents. Dialogue from certain characters calling them a rodent or mouse does line up with classing them as a rodent. Alright, some additional resources. Someone on Reddit made a taxonomic tree of Rain World, which is actually a pretty interesting way of looking at things. This one is designed to show developing relations between things over time. And Das Zombes, I believe that's how you pronounce it, the Rain World wildlife video is also quite interesting. I'd recommend checking those out. I will link them in the description. Alright, and that is the end. That's all from me, so goodbye and thanks for watching.